I sat in the corner of the living room with my back straight, hands resting on my knees, and watched my family divide the estate of the woman who had built it. The lawyer had barely opened his folder when my father stood up and cut him off with the particular kind of authority that men who have never actually led anyone mistake for leadership. He announced that the 3 San Diego properties belonged to Derek. He announced that I had been taken care of by the United States Navy. He announced this without looking at me, in the same tone he used when he was explaining something obvious to someone who had been slow to understand it. The room applauded. My mother nodded. Derek raised his wine glass in my direction with the expression of a man who has just won something and wants to make sure the losing party knows it. My name is Cole Matthews. I am 32 years old, a lieutenant in the United States Navy Supply Corps, currently stationed at Naval Base, San Diego, California. I have spent the last 8 years managing logistics chains that move medical supplies, ammunition, and aviation equipment across carrier strike groups in the Pacific. I know how to track a single missing component through a chain of custody that spans 3 continents. I know how money moves and where it hides when someone is trying to move it quietly. My family did not know this about me, or rather, they knew it and had decided it was irrelevant. Before I go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Hit that like if you've ever watched someone take credit for something you built. Back to Cole. What my father did not know, standing in the living room of the Pacific Beach House with his manufactured authority and his announcement about Derek's inheritance, was that the house he was standing in had not belonged to Margaret Matthews for 3 years. The metal briefcase at my feet contained 8 property deeds, each stamped with the red seal of the San Diego County Clerk, each bearing my name as owner of record, each recorded on May 14th, 2021. I sat with my hands on my knees and watched Derek smile and thought about the specific kind of patience required to hold a position under fire. The patience of someone who knows the outcome and is waiting for the other side to finish moving before they play their hand. The lawyer reached for his pen. I waited one more moment. Then I asked him when his file had last been updated. To understand what that question meant, you have to go back 20 years to a kitchen table in Pacific Beach and feel the specific texture of what it was like to grow up invisible. My father, Thomas Matthews, ran the table the way he ran everything, as a performance. He dispensed attention the way men dispense money when they want people to understand that they are in control of the supply. Derek was the investment. I was the overhead. The clearest version of this I can give you is a dinner from my sophomore year of high school. Derek's varsity football team had lost badly that evening, 14 points to 35, and my father spent the meal reconstructing the game in a version where Derek's brilliance was the only constant, and everyone around him had failed to meet it. The coach had called the wrong plays. The offensive line had been slow. The weather had been a factor. In my father's accounting, Derek never lost. He was only failed by external forces. I had placed my semester report card on the table between the coleslaw and the breadbasket. Straight A's, calculus, physics, history, everything at the top. I had smoothed the edges and waited for a pause in the football commentary. After 10 minutes, my father looked in my direction. He pointed at the empty serving platter and told me we were out of ribs and asked me to check the kitchen. He had not seen the report card, or he had seen it, and it had registered as something below the threshold of his attention. I was not a person to be celebrated at that table. I was the staff. The canyon that had opened at dinner became structural during junior year. Derek needed a suit for homecoming. Italian wool, $800, purchased without discussion, while my mother smiled at her golden boy and called it an investment in his confidence. Later that same week, I asked for $50 for advanced SAT prep books. My mother told me we were tight on cash. She told me the library existed. She told me I was being selfish. $50 for my future. $800 for Derek's confidence. The arithmetic was not complicated. The night I told them I had been accepted to Navy Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, my father was watching television. He looked at the acceptance letter during a commercial break. He said it suited me, that the military was structured, that I didn't need to worry about being too independent there. He said it saved him tuition money. No congratulations. No hand on the shoulder. Just the quiet relief of a man removing a line item from his budget. The morning I left for Newport, my mother could not drive me to the bus station because Derek had chipped a tooth opening a beer bottle and needed a dentist. My father had a tea time. I took a Greyhound. I watched the neighborhood disappear through the window and understood something I had been arranging in the back of my mind for years. That I had not been leaving my family, because in any meaningful sense, I had never had one. Newport was cold and wet, and the first place in my life where I was assessed by objective standards. When the drill instructor stopped at my bunk during inspection and bounced a quarter off the sheets and watched it spring back and said outstanding, I felt a hunger I had been carrying for years and had not known how to name. I was not being praised because I was Thomas Matthews' son or Derek's brother. I was being assessed on the quality of my work. The military did not break me. It gave me a language for what I already was. And weapons, I learned in those years, do not cry when they are cut out of a will. They reload. My suspicions did not begin at the reading of the will. They began 3 years earlier. During a 4-day Liberty Pass, I used to visit Margaret at the Pacific Beach House. I unlocked the front door, and the smell hit me before the light did. Wet drywall and mildew. The particular scent of a building that has been absorbing water for longer than anyone has been paying attention to it. Margaret was in her armchair with a knitted blanket pulled to her chin. In the corner of the living room, a plastic bucket sat on the Persian rug, half full of brown water. I asked her about the roof. She told me she had told Derek. She told me he handled the accounts now. She told me he had said materials were expensive and she just needed to wait out one more rainy season. I looked at the water-stained ceiling and then back at the bucket and did the math that any supply officer would do automatically. Margaret owned 8 rental properties in San Diego, fully occupied since the 1990s, in one of the most persistently expensive real estate markets in the country. The idea that there was not enough cash to repair a section of roof was not a logistics problem. It was mathematically impossible unless the cash was going somewhere else. That night, after Margaret took her medication, I went to the mahogany desk in the study and opened the ledger. What I found was not messy bookkeeping. Messy bookkeeping looks like honest confusion, misplaced entries, inconsistent categories, arithmetic that doesn't carry. What I found looked like something else. Plumbing repair, $3,500, no receipt attached. A scribbled note in the margin. Landscaping service, $2,200 per month. I looked at that line for a long time. The rental properties had gravel yards and succulents. There was no landscaping to speak of. The next morning, Derek arrived in a Ford F-150 Raptor painted code orange, sitting on 37-inch tires. He was wearing Oakley sunglasses and holding a $7 coffee. I asked him where the truck had come from. He said crypto. He said Bitcoin. He used the words he had heard on television to cover the gap between his income and his lifestyle. And he said them with the practiced ease of a man who had been telling this story long enough that he had stopped noticing the cracks in it. I drove to the Garnet Avenue rental that afternoon. The tenant who answered the door, a man named Mike, had sweat through his shirt. I asked him about the new HVAC unit, the one logged in the ledger as an $8,000 replacement the previous month. He laughed with the specific bitterness of someone who has stopped expecting to be helped. He told me the air conditioning had been dead for 3 months. He had called Derek a dozen times. I asked if I could see the unit. He took me to the side yard. The air conditioner was a rusted box manufactured in 1990. I photographed the unit. I photographed the serial number plate. I stood in the afternoon heat. and understood what I was looking at. Derek had not spent $8,000 on a new air conditioner. He had pocketed the money, left a paying tenant to work in a building that violated habitability standards, and logged it in the ledger as a maintenance expense. This was not incompetence. This was not the entitled carelessness of a man who had never been held accountable for anything. This was a specific, deliberate financial crime committed against the woman who had built everything he was spending. I drove back to the house that night through a rainstorm. I spread the photographs on the tea table in front of Margaret and told her what I had found. She looked at the photo of the 1990 unit for a long time. Then she put her reading glasses down and looked at me with eyes that were not confused, but exhausted. The exhaustion of a person who has known something for a long time and has been managing the weight of not acting on it. She told me she knew. Then she told me why she had said nothing. My father had given her an ultimatum 3 years earlier. If she questioned Derek's management, if she involved lawyers or police, Thomas would cut her off from me. He had told her he would tell me she had gone senile. He had used access to his own son as leverage to protect his other son's theft. Margaret straightened in her chair. The frailty seemed to leave her. She told me she wanted to transfer everything, all of it, before she died. She asked me if I had the discipline to accept the mission. I looked at the bucket of brown water. I told her, yes, ma'am. Monday morning, 0800 hours. I called my cousin Dylan, a mechanic who drove a battered Silverado and had stayed out of the family's social performances for as long as I could remember. I told him I needed a driver and a witness, and that he should not tell anyone where we were going. He asked no questions. We loaded Margaret into Dylan's truck and drove downtown, parking in the alley behind the offices of Davis and Associates. Mr. Davis was an estate attorney who had known Margaret for 30 years and who had agreed, when I called him the previous evening, to have documents prepared by morning. We went in through the back. The documents on Mr. Davis's desk were a revocable living trust and 8 quitclaim deeds, one for each property in the Matthews portfolio. The trust named me as sole beneficiary and successor trustee. The deeds transferred each property directly into the trust, bypassing probate and superseding any will that could be drafted, altered, or presented after the fact. Margaret reviewed every paragraph. She asked questions. She pushed back on 2 clauses that she wanted revised before she signed anything. Mr. Davis made the changes. She reviewed them again. Then she picked up the pen. The sound of her signature on each document, the scratch of ink on heavy bond paper, the thud of the notary's seal, was the most orderly sound I had heard in years. Pacific Beach House, signed. Garnet Avenue Rentals, signed. The warehouse on Miramar Road, signed. The family home in Pacific Beach, where my father was currently holding court over shrimp cocktail and cheap Chardonnay, signed. When the last document was notarized, Margaret gripped my wrist with surprising strength. She told me the most important part of the operation was radio silence. She told me to go back to my unit, to deploy if I was deployed, to let Derek drive the truck, and let my father brag at the country club, and let them sleep in their arrogance. She told me that a comfortable enemy is a careless enemy. I told her I understood. I flew back to base the following morning with the briefcase locked and checked in my luggage. For 3 years I watched from a distance. Deployments, duty cycles, the ordinary distance of military service, while Derek spent money that was no longer his to spend, and my parents continued the performance of a family that had chosen its favorite and was managing the consequences of that choice. I endured every comment about my government salary. I held my position through every holiday where I was seated at the far end of the table, and Derek was toasted at the head of it. I held the position because I knew something they did not. I knew that every dollar Derek stole was evidence accumulating in a paper trail I already owned. I knew that the ground they were standing on had changed ownership 3 years ago, and none of them had noticed. I knew that the moment was coming, and that the moment would be enough. The question I asked Mr. Hollis about his file date landed in the room the way a dropped piece of equipment lands in a quiet space, the sound preceding the understanding of what it means. He blinked. He said the file had last been updated in 2018. I set the Halliburton briefcase on the glass coffee table. I cleared the Chardonnay glasses with one sweep of my forearm. I unlatched the case, the snap of the clasps crisp and loud in the silence, and lifted the lid. Inside, the navy blue binders and the stack of original trust documents sat organized with the same precision I applied to everything I was responsible for. I took out the first deed and held it up under the chandelier. I told the room what it was. I said the owner of record was Cole Tyler Matthews. I said the date of recording was May 14th, 2021. I placed it on the table in front of Mr. Hollis. Then I went through all 8, one by one, each deed placed with deliberate care in front of the lawyer, whose job it was to understand what he was looking at. By the time I reached the 8th document, the deed for the Pacific Beach family home, the house we were standing in, the room had gone from murmurs to complete silence. Mr. Hollis was sweating. He examined the notary acknowledgments. He examined the recording stamps. He looked up at my father with the expression of a man delivering news that he wishes he were not the one delivering. He confirmed that the chain of title was clean. He confirmed that the transfers had been made into a revocable living trust 3 years before Margaret's death, and then by quitclaim into my name. He confirmed that the will my father had just presented, the document he had spent 30 minutes building his case around, was superseded entirely by transfers that had already been completed and recorded. Margaret had not left them an empire. She had left them a document that described something that no longer existed. My father's color changed. He did not shout. He sat down heavily in his armchair, and his mouth moved without producing sound, which was the most honest expression I had ever seen on his face. Derek was not quiet. He came across the room in a straight line, his face twisted, spitting accusations, manipulation, coercion, senility, fraud, the specific vocabulary of a man who has been caught and is searching for a frame that makes him the victim. He charged at the table and swept the deeds onto the floor. He moved toward me. I dropped into a ready position. I told him once not to touch me. He stopped. Not from discipline. Derek had never developed discipline, but from something more instinctive, the recognition that I was not the person at this table who needed to be afraid. Dylan stepped forward from the back of the room. He said he had driven Margaret to the lawyer's office 3 years ago. He said he had sat in the waiting room for 2 hours while she reviewed every paragraph. He said she had not been confused. She had been deliberate. She had told Mr. Davis exactly why she was making the transfer, and the reason was standing in this room right now in her dress uniform. The guests, Derek's associates, my father's business contacts, the people who had applauded 10 minutes ago when my dispossession was announced, were very still. I picked up the deeds from the floor and returned them to the briefcase. I told Derek he had 48 hours to clear his personal belongings from the property management office. I told him I had already completed a full audit of the accounts and that he should not attempt to delete or alter any digital records because I had cloned the drives remotely the previous Saturday night. I told my father that the will was now a historical artifact with no legal weight, and that Mr. Hollis was free to file it wherever documents go when they describe things that no longer exist. I picked up the case. I told the room to enjoy the shrimp cocktail. I walked out. Monday morning, I arrived at the property management office with the San Diego County Sheriff's deputy for civil standby. This is standard procedure when a property transfer is contested and the previous manager has reason to be uncooperative. Derek gave reason. He was shoving papers into a cardboard box when I arrived, his shirt untucked, his eyes the color of someone who has not slept. When he saw the deputy in the doorway behind me, he did not go quiet. He threw a stapler at the drywall. He screamed about what he had built and what I had stolen, and every other reframing available to a man who needs to believe that what happened to him was done to him rather than caused by him. I told him to take personal items only. I told the deputy to ensure no hard drives or business files left the building. I walked to the desktop computer on the far desk and unplugged it from the wall. Derek made it to the keyboard before I did. He was trying to format the drive, to erase the landscaping invoices and the fake receipts, and the 3 years of maintenance fraud before anyone could examine them. I told him it was too late. I had cloned the drive remotely. Every deleted email, every altered spreadsheet, every transaction he had moved through accounts he thought only he could see was already on a server I controlled. He sat in his chair and looked at the floor. Outside, a tow truck was backing into the lot. The F-150 Raptor, code orange, 37-inch tires, 3 months behind on payments, went onto the hook. I watched through the window. The truck's paint caught the morning light one more time before it was dragged out of the lot, leaving oil stains on the asphalt and nothing else. Brooke arrived as Derek was being walked out with his box of desk items. She had heard about the account transfers. I had sent formal notice to all tenants directing future rent payments to the trust account, and that information had reached her quickly. She was not there to support him. She was there to confront him. She had taken the engagement ring to a jeweler that morning. She threw it at his chest in the parking lot and told him it was cubic zirconia. The ring bounced off his polo shirt and landed on the asphalt. She got in her own car and left. My parents arrived in time to see Derek sitting on the curb with a cardboard box. My mother looked at me with the expression of a woman who has just watched the outcome of every decision she made over 30 years arrive simultaneously. She said something about loans and equity and fixing things. I told her I had checked the public records. They had taken a second mortgage on their house 6 months ago and given the money to Derek to cover a gambling debt. They had no equity left. They had bet everything on the wrong outcome. The outcome had arrived. 3 days later, an IRS subpoena was delivered to my apartment. Derek had claimed the rental income as his own on federal loan applications. He had taken cash rent from tenants to avoid a paper trail and had not declared it. He had inflated his income on financing documents for the truck. The IRS does not negotiate with family sentiment. They negotiate with math. I signed the witness statement. I packed the navy blue binders, the highlighted bank statements, the photograph of the rusted 1990 air conditioner, the fake maintenance invoices, into a shipping box addressed to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I taped it shut and took it to the post office. Karma, I have found, does not require assistance. It only requires accurate records. That night I sat alone in my apartment with a glass of water and the framed photograph of Margaret on my desk. I had won in every measurable sense. The estate was protected. The thief was facing federal prosecution. The enablers were facing the consequences of their choices. The briefcase was locked in my closet. The deeds were filed. The silence in the apartment was absolute. The victory was real, and it tasted like nothing. I had living parents and a living brother. But the family I had wanted, the one that saw me, the one that called when I was deployed not to ask for something, but just to ask, hadn't existed and wouldn't exist. I had known this for years and had continued to want it anyway, which is the specific human habit of hoping that the thing you need will eventually become the thing you have. I looked at Margaret's photograph and thought about the bucket of brown water on her Persian rug. I thought about the choice she had made, the careful, deliberate, 3-year operation she had run from her armchair to make sure that what she had built did not go to the people who had used her silence against her. I had been the only one she trusted. That was not nothing. That was everything. I treated the Matthews estate the way I had been trained to treat every logistics operation, as a system that required accurate assessment, clear procedures, and consistent execution. The first thing I did was fire every contractor Derek had been using, not out of punishment, but out of basic professional standards. The men he had hired for maintenance work billed triple for labor and showed up to jobs inconsistently, which in a portfolio of 8 occupied rental properties meant 8 sets of tenants living with unresolved issues and building documentation for breach of habitability suits. I replaced them with a single construction firm owned by a Marine Corps veteran named Porter, who had been operating in San Diego for 12 years and whose references were uniformly current tenants rather than former ones. I signed a service-level agreement that required a technician on site within 24 hours of any reported maintenance issue. No exceptions, no supply chain explanations, no waiting out another rainy season. The roofs were repaired, the plumbing was overhauled, the Garnet Avenue units were painted for the first time in a decade. I did not raise rent. I simply stopped funding Derek's lifestyle and redirected the cash flow toward the properties themselves, which turned out to be sufficient to run the operation profitably and reinvest in improvement simultaneously. The arithmetic was not complicated. It had never been complicated. It had simply been obscured. The change in tone from tenants was immediate and, I will admit, unexpected in its emotional weight. Mrs. Gable, the retired teacher in Unit 4 at Garnet Avenue, left a loaf of banana bread on the management office step with a note that said she had been waiting 8 years to be able to call the repair line and have someone actually answer. I kept the note. I have moved it to 3 different apartments since then, and it is currently in my kitchen drawer. I spent a week clearing the Pacific Beach house of what Derek had left behind. The gaming monitors, the designer shoes in the closet, the humidors for cigars he did not smoke. I filled contractor bags and hauled them to the dumpster without sentiment. I was not angry doing this work. I was focused. There is a difference. While clearing the master bedroom, I found a leather-bound journal under the mattress. It was Margaret's, dated from 5 years earlier. I sat on the edge of the bed in the afternoon light and read it. Halfway through, I found an entry about me. She had written that I had sad eyes but steady ones. She had written that I reminded her of her husband, that I did not ask for attention, only for work. She had written that I would be the firekeeper of the family even if the others were too blind to see it. I sat with that for a long time. For 32 years I had believed I was the disappointment. I had believed I was the cold, invisible son who did not photograph well at family events and whose achievements did not register on the scale my father used to measure things. I had believed that the silence when I placed the report card on the table was the accurate assessment, that I was simply not the kind of person my family celebrated. Margaret had seen something else. She had been seeing it for years and recording it in a journal under her mattress in a damp house while my family spent her money. I hung her portrait above the fireplace, the photograph from when she had bought her first delivery truck, young, focused, already building something. The house felt different after that, less like a crime scene, and more like a place that had been returned to its proper condition. 2 months after the reading of the will, my mother called. My father had been admitted to Scripps Memorial with elevated blood pressure. The bank had sent a notice of default on the second mortgage. She asked for help with the medical bills and the house and the situation generally, in the tone of a woman who expected to be rescued from the consequences of her choices, because rescue was what I had always been available for. I told her I would pay my father's medical bills directly to the hospital. I told her I would not wire cash. I told her I understood they would lose the house, and that this was the outcome of a bet they had made, and I would not place a different bet on their behalf. She told me I was cruel. I told her it was accountability. I told her it was the lesson she had forgotten to teach her other son. I hung up. It was the hardest phone call I had made in years, not because I doubted the decision, but because the decision was correct. And correct decisions about people you wanted to love differently do not feel like victories. They feel like amputations. Necessary. Clean. Final. 3 months after the dust settled, my father asked to meet me. He did not choose the steakhouse where he used to hold court with his business partners. He chose a diner off the Pacific Coast Highway, the kind of place with thick white coffee mugs and laminated menus, the kind of place that does not perform anything. He was driving a 10-year-old Camry with a dented bumper. He walked in wearing a polo shirt that was too big for him now, and he sat down across from me and looked at his coffee, and did not immediately look at me. He told me Derek was facing trial. He told me Derek had said the theft was their fault, that they had made him this way, that they had built a man who did not know how to survive because he had never needed to. My father said Derek was probably right. It was the first time in 32 years that Thomas Matthews had said he was wrong about something. I waited for the anger to arrive, and it did not come. What came instead was a kind of heavy pity, the specific feeling of looking at a man who has spent his life building a shrine to his own judgment and is now sitting in the rubble of it, in a diner off the Pacific Coast Highway, ordering black coffee with shaking hands. I told him I forgave him. He looked up as if he expected me to be saying something else. I told him I was not forgiving him for his benefit. I was forgiving him because carrying the weight of 32 years of resentment toward a man who would never change was a heavy pack to ruck, and I was setting it down. Then I told him the terms. The trust would cover his medical bills and ensure he and my mother had housing. He would have no role in the business and no say in any decision I made. He would not advise, manipulate, or involve himself in any aspect of my life. If he held those terms, I would hold mine. If he violated them, the terms ended, and so did whatever remained between us. He nodded. A single tear tracked through the stubble on his cheek. I left before the lunch rush. That afternoon, I met with Mr. Davis to finalize the amendment to the Matthews Family Trust I had been drafting for 2 months. The amendment established the Margaret Matthews Scholarship Fund, 20% of gross rental profits directed annually to the children of active-duty Navy enlisted personnel, petty officers, and below, the men and women who do the hardest work in the service and carry the most financial pressure. Mr. Davis asked me if I was certain about 20%. I told him I was certain. The reason was not complicated. I had been 17 years old when I needed $50 for SAT prep books, and my mother had called me selfish for asking. I had watched that $50 become the difference between a path I built for myself and a path that was never going to be offered to me. I understood exactly how much $50 could weigh when you were the child at the wrong end of the family ledger. Margaret's legacy was not going to be a portfolio of rental properties managed with institutional precision. It was going to be a ladder, the specific, concrete, unglamorous kind that allows a person with ability and no runway to take the next step. That was what she had deserved from her family and had not received. That was what I could now provide for someone else. That evening, I stood on the balcony of the Pacific Beach House and watched the sun go down over the ocean. My hair was not in a regulation bun for the first time in years. I let it go in the salt wind. The waves came in steady and indifferent, the same as they always had, the same as they would after I was gone. I reached into my pocket and touched the small Bible Margaret had given me the day I commissioned. I did not need to open it to find the verse. It had been inside me since the day she showed it to me. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. I had been the one they passed over. I had been the one they excluded from every toast and every conversation and every document they drafted at the family desk. I had been the one they expected to disappear quietly into a government salary and a deployment schedule, and the modest life they had decided was sufficient for someone like me. They had not understood what they were building by rejecting me. They had not understood that the years of being invisible had taught me to see clearly, that the years of being underestimated had taught me to prepare thoroughly. That the years of sitting at the end of the table had given me an unobstructed view of exactly what the people at the head of it were doing. The most important thing I learned through all of it was not about real estate or living trusts or the mechanics of a quitclaim deed. It was about the difference between waiting to be seen and building something worth seeing. I had spent the first half of my life waiting for my family to recognize what I was. I had placed report cards on dinner tables and accepted letters on coffee tables and taken Greyhound buses to destinations my family could not be bothered to drive me to. And I had told myself that eventually the evidence would be sufficient. The evidence was never going to be sufficient, not because I was insufficient, but because the people I was presenting it to had already decided what they were looking at and were not in the market for a different conclusion. The shift happened when I stopped presenting evidence to them and started building something that did not require their assessment to be real. I had the balcony of a house that belonged to me. I had 8 properties occupied by tenants who now called the repair line and had their calls answered. I had a scholarship fund in the name of a woman who had seen me clearly from her armchair with a bucket of brown water at her feet. I had done my job. The Pacific coast went dark in stages, orange to purple to the deep blue that settles over the water when the last of the light has gone. The waves continued. I am 32 years old. I am a lieutenant in the United States Navy. I am the sole trustee of an estate that was built by a woman who started with a single delivery truck and the discipline to treat every dollar as something worth accounting for. I intend to honor that. The builders rejected the stone. The stone became the cornerstone. It was always going to.